So welcome to this presentation, which is done co-jointly between myself at CosmeticChroma and CTI, so that's Center Testing International. I am actually the technical speaker for CTI today, so we have a lot to get through, and I hope we'll be able to get through most of it. If if we don't manage to get round to your questions, you can email me those at any time. That's one of the benefits of joining this webinar. So the housekeeping, I think you've already done this. So it's basically keeping your microphone off and your video camera off. However, during the Q&A, it's great for it to be more interactive. So you can, if you're able to, turn on your camera and your microphone. So just a little bit about me, in case you don't know much about me yet. I've worked in the cosmetic industry for about 20 years, and you can see that I've worked in the UK, Paris, and Milan. However, I've worked with all global markets, and in particular the EU, the US, Asia, especially China, but also the Middle East and Africa. I decided actually to start my own business. This was last year. So CosmeticChroma was only really launched in July of last year. And the reason why I decided to do that was also to help cosmetic industry professionals like you to master cosmetics development, but also how to launch the products as well, because it isn't actually that straightforward, certainly in developing the products and then trying to put them on global markets. I used to be a global head of regulatory and quality at Dolce Gabbana, and equally global director of regulatory affairs at Intercos. I've lived in 7 different countries, including Africa and the US, and also France. So basically, I've become very flexible, and I currently am based in Italy, near Milan. So what we're going to discuss today, or certainly my section, it's about 30 minutes, is we're going to look at China's cosmetic regulation that was published. We will quickly review the cosmetic definition in China, and then we will look at an overview of the registration process and the requirements, looking especially at the differences between general and special cosmetics. Then we'll briefly touch on cosmetic ingredient requirements, the China responsible person, and quality and safety. So China's cosmetic regulation, I'm sure some of you already know that this legislation was actually published and became effective of the 1st of January 2021. And the new regulation is called the Cosmetic Supervision and Administration Regulation, or the CSAR. Previously, there was the CHSR, which is the existing, the former Cosmetic Hygiene Supervision Regulations, which was introduced back in 1989. And in fact, I did get involved in lobbying with China when I was representing L'Oreal at the China Task Force at Cosmetic Europe. And there was a big shift in the mindset of the government in China to try to adopt a more European style system, although there's still a long way to go, but there's definitely a lot of progress. So in fact, the CSAR is a complicated legislation, and I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible in this webinar, as we don't have very much time as well. But I will do a training course on China later on in the year. But basically, you have 3 key areas, which is registration and filing. So in order to be able to sell your products, production and operations, so that's the part during the development of the products. And then there are special criteria for children's cosmetics. Under each one of these categories, there are a tremendous amount of regulations. And I won't go into this today because I simply do not have the time to do so. But it's just to show you that the complexity of China regulations is pretty high. Cosmetic definition in China. Now, the cosmetics definition is very similar in a way to that in the EU, However, what they say is chemical products. So they say that chemical products to be applied on any external part of the human body, so this is the skin, hair, nails, and lips, and so on, by spreading, spraying, or other similar mechanisms. And the purpose is for cleansing, protecting, beautifying, and modifying. If you know the European cosmetics definition, you may know that we actually have 6 functions in the EU definition. And we also include the mucous cavity of the mouth. So basically, the key point is that, and this is also the same for the EU, if you're not putting the product on the external parts of the human body, it is not classified as a cosmetic in China, also the case in the EU. And equally, if it's to be applied to damaged skin, equally it is not a cosmetic. And toothpaste is an interesting case in China, and they have decided that it will be managed in line with general cosmetic products. And cosmetics does not apply to soaps unless there are cosmetic efficacy claims. So bearing in mind an air freshener, clearly you don't apply it to the human body, and therefore it's not a cosmetic. For damaged skin products, that would be more likely a drug. And clearly, ingestion, oral administration, or injection definitely will not be a cosmetic, and anything for prevention or treatment of diseases, which are clearly drugs. However, the difference with China and the EU is they have another special category between general cosmetics and drugs, which we will look at now. So let's have a look at the overview of the registration process and requirements, and have a look also at the differences between general versus special cosmetics. So we have 6 criteria, 6 aspects that we can look at. The first one is about the product scope. So for general cosmetics, these are products without specific functional claims. And special cosmetics, which is the category I just mentioned, it's an additional category. These are products with specific functions, and I'll show you these on the next slide. For number 2, we have the regulatory pathway, which in this case, if you want to launch in China, you can file with the National Medical Products Administration, NMPA, or you can also file with the provincial MPA. However, for special cosmetics, you actually have to proceed with the registration, and you have to go with the central NMPA. You cannot do it with the provincial MPAs. In terms of documentation, general cosmetics have standard documents, generally the typical ones you use to register or notify a product. Special cosmetics, however, have a big exception, and that is obligatory efficacy testing. You will see under aspect number 4, testing requirements, that there is mandatory efficacy testing in Chinese accredited laboratories, and this is why we have CTI here. Sometimes you may be asked to do clinical testing, and sometimes you may be asked to do detailed safety and toxicological testing as well. So it is quite heavy. Even if you've done efficacy testing in Europe and you conform to all the ISO standards and all the relevant other standards, China insists that you retest everything again in their accredited laboratories, of which CTI is one. 5th aspect looks at approval timelines and validity. So general cosmetics, the filing is faster, and once accepted, you can place the product on the market. But for special cosmetics, it's a registration, which is different, because you cannot place the product on the market until you've received an approval from the NMPA. And then the last point is post-market obligations. For general cosmetics, you are required to submit an annual report. And for special cosmetics, you will need to renew your license every 5 years. And do note that they have much stricter post-market surveillance compared to general cosmetics. So let's go into each of these in detail. So the product scope, the first aspect, the classification is the first important point. And to get your classification, as always in regulatory, you always start with the definition of the cosmetic product for that market you're going into, because you need to know if it's covered under the cosmetic legislation or another type of legislation. I have a full regulatory essentials course which goes into detail about that. So general cosmetics is just a pre-market notification, a little bit similar to the EU. We have skincare, hair care, nail care products, makeup and perfumes. However, special cosmetics require full-on registration. So hair dyes, hair perms, whitening, sunscreens, anti-hair loss, or products with specific claims, or products with specific efficacy, such as anti-acne, anti-wrinkle, and anti-dandruff. The pathway process. The first thing that you will need to do in both cases of general cosmetics and special cosmetics is to appoint a domestic responsible person locally in China. You cannot function as a foreign importer into China without having a Chinese domestic responsible person. They will then need to do a preliminary review of the formula and label and provide you with an identification number. You will then need to proceed to conduct safety and efficacy testing. So if we look on the left-hand side at general cosmetics, you will basically be needing to do all this preliminary phase before you can prepare your dossier. This normally, particularly the testing and getting your safety report done, probably takes about 1 to 2 months, give or take. However, when you look at the same on the special cosmetics side, to get your registration dossier ready to be submitted online takes 4 to 6 months. And that is mainly due to the additional testing that you have to do locally in China. Once the registration or the filing dossiers are ready, you can then submit them online for administrative review. For general cosmetics, about a month later, you could expect to get an electronic filing certificate, and the validity is infinite. You can then put your products onto the market in China. However, there is an official technical review, and I've put to be determined, because in fact, it's not always done systematically. It's done when the authorities wish to review something, they wish to check something, and so on. And so if that happens, they will do it with your product already on the market. You could liken this to the EU post-market surveillance, which they do. Now, with the special cosmetics, once you've done the online submission, that will take about 3 to 5 months before you get a response. Well, you could get a response a little bit before, where there could be a lot of back and forth on questions, and they undertake something called an official format and technical review. If you successfully pass that review, then you will receive an approval license for your product with a validity of 5 years. After that, you can upload images of your commercially available product labels, and then you can import and sell your cosmetic in China. As you will see at the bottom of each of these, there is a little box. For general cosmetics, you will have to submit annual reports, and for special cosmetics, you will need to do renewals of your licenses. Looking at the third aspect, which is the documentation. So some of this is pretty standard. You need to fill in the application form and also specify the intended use of your product. This would be the statement of identity, which in Europe, which is the function of the product. Again, you would need to do the product name, and you yourself need to have determined the classification. You need to add the product formula with the ingredients and the INCI names, percentages and functions. But the additional thing for China, even for general cosmetics, is that you have to submit ingredient submission codes. And this is a nightmare. Basically, every time you want to launch a product into China, you will have to associate safety data with your ingredients in your product. And they ask you for a trade name, sadly, and a lot of other information. And this has to be done every single time. You will also need to submit a compliant Chinese label sample and also a safety assessment report, including tox data and safety evaluation. So the usual testing reports, microtest, this is the QA, physical chemical results, or QC rather, quality control, and human safety if applicable. And then they can ask for packaging material information, so they may just want samples or images of the primary packaging. And as usual, when you're exporting, it's a free sale certificate issued by your government of the country of origin, and then an authorization letter, which is essentially a power of attorney if filing is done by a domestic RP for the company. And then you also have the all-important GMP certification, and we will look at this shortly. An important point, or an important differentiator between general cosmetics and special cosmetics in China is actually the ingredients and also the claims of the product. So if your product has medium or low risk ingredients, it will also be classified under a general cosmetic. However, if you have high risk ingredients, it will be classified as a special cosmetic. And by this, I mean probably OTC products in the US, all of those active ingredients, those will definitely be classified as high risk ingredients. You can actually find a list of all the ingredients on the China database, which we'll talk about in a second. So you will be required to submit all the same information as for a general cosmetic, but the important point is that you might be required to do more in-depth efficacy testing and clinical testing reports if applicable. The difference is in the depth of the data that is submitted versus general cosmetics, and of course the timelines. So here are some documents. This is the authorization letter. You would normally have your authorization letter, which is essentially a power of attorney. And generally speaking, you will need to notarize this with your local Chamber of Commerce, which essentially validates your signature on the document. And then after that, you will need to legalize the document, and you get some really beautiful stamps. However, these stamps can be very expensive, but it's necessary for China, and you will have to get those legalized at the China embassy. Now, the important point about general cosmetics is that they should generally be exempt from the mandatory animal testing. Up until 2001, before this legislation came into place, there was always this problem of animal testing to go to China. But now you can actually avoid doing the animal testing if you meet certain conditions. And the first one really is about the classification. So imported general non-special cosmetics are eligible products for exemption. And we've seen these products earlier on the previous slide. Special cosmetics, however, are not eligible for exemption. And in fact, animal testing will have to be carried out in China in an accredited laboratory before you can import and even submit your documents online. So the important point is that you will need to submit a GMP certificate and a cosmetic product safety report also as essential mandatory conditions to have this exemption. Here's an example of a good manufacturing practices certificate. This is from the Italian government, and the certificate has to be issued by the government or the regulatory authority. You actually cannot use a third-party certification standard. They will not accept it. It has to be a government document. And clearly, the certificate must be up to date, and it must clearly indicate your name or the brand's name, address and scope of production. So this will be your where your brand is located, and you then will need to contact your authorities locally to get this. If the certificate is not in Chinese, which is probably likely, you will need to get a notarized Chinese translation, and this must be submitted as part of the products filing dossier. Now, in terms of the safety assessment, something that's a little bit interesting, the safety assessment is actually done as a dynamic evaluation. So you will, as a first assessment, you will submit your safety assessment to the authorities online for general cosmetics. And then sometimes the safety might need to be reevaluated. So, for example, if there are any ingredient changes, so if the formula is updated, so you have new ingredients, concentration changes, and so on, you will actually have to redo the safety assessment. Well, actually, that's standard practice anyway, but they need to know about that. New scientific data, so if there's new tox data or safety data that becomes available either in the public domain or information that you're aware of that affects the product or its ingredients, you will need to get another safety evaluation done. Regulatory update, so if the NMPA updates the safety standards, which they could probably do, or they ban or restrict certain ingredients, which is a definite possibility, you will then have to redo the safety evaluation. And then post-market surveillance issues. So if you encounter any adverse events or consumer complaints, then the product will also be subject to a re-evaluation. Now, as I mentioned before, the testing. So unfortunately, if you've spent a lot of money doing all the efficacy claim testing, all accredited to ISO and following all the right standards, global standards, so on, unfortunately, you have to retest the efficacy again in China accredited laboratories. Here's an example of a CTI laboratory, very clean at the top left. And then you will see a variety of different instruments on this slide, which are actually used to do different types of tests accordingly. Now, efficacy claim evaluation is a really big topic, and I don't have time to go into that right now. But certainly there is more information on my website, and you can always email me if you would like to have more information about this topic, because it's a great topic and very, very interesting. Now, the fifth aspect, of course, particularly for brands, if you want to sell as quickly as possible, is the timelines. And of course, the timelines for China have to be included in your new product development plan, as all countries. But the one point that you need to be mindful of is the special cosmetics, because there are markets around the world that up to 3 months is fairly standard for a cosmetic. However, what is not standard is up to a year. Now, these type of products also in North Asia, so Japan, Korea, they also have long times to get authorization as well. So you will need to factor this in into your planning of your product development. And we've already gone through some of this detail already on some of the previous slides. Right, let's have a brief look at cosmetic ingredient requirements. Now, ingredient lists in China. So if we look at the boxes in green on the right-hand side, you will see that the actual listing, ingredient listings, are fairly similar to that for the EU. And you will see that basically you have a list of restricted ingredients, you have positive lists, but you have one specific for hair dyes, and then you have sunscreens, preservatives, and colorants, as is the case in the EU. However, of course, you have the inventory of prohibited ingredients in China, and you also have limits of some hazardous ingredients in cosmetics as well. Now, the big difference with China and the EU, although the EU does have a fully fledged database of all the cosmetic ingredients, the difference is in China, the IECIC. So this is the existing inventory for cosmetic ingredients in China. And this inventory, as of 2021, had a total number of 8,972 cosmetic ingredients in China. I'm sure that this list has greatly expanded since then. Now, what you have to do is whether you're doing a general or a special cosmetic, is you have to check that the ingredients that are in your formulation, note it's ingredients, not raw materials, you have to check that they are listed on this list. If they are not listed, then they will not be considered as existing substances, and you will therefore have to register it as a new cosmetic ingredient. I, of course, would recommend that you avoid doing this because it would be very expensive to do. I don't know if anyone has managed to actually add a new cosmetic ingredient to the list, and I should think it would take quite a long time. Similar to the EU in the fact that if you want to add a new preservative to the positive list, colorant to the colorant list, you will have to undergo a long process, a lot of information, probably 2 to 3 years. So avoid if you can and try to find alternatives wherever possible. China responsible person. Very briefly, a China responsible person has similar obligations and responsibilities as in Europe. They are the ones that have to submit the registrations or the filing. Everything is in Chinese. And they will handle also the special cosmetics as well as the general cosmetics on your behalf. They also have safety and quality oversight, so they also need to ensure that the product complies with Chinese safety, labeling, efficacy, standards, etc. As I mentioned on a previous slide, there are a plethora of standards that have been issued by the Chinese government, so this is quite a complicated task for them. They also have the obligation to maintain the cosmetic product safety assessment report and also other technical documents. They also need to do adverse reaction monitoring. So this is, as I'm sure you know, this is once the product is on the Chinese market, you actually have to ensure you have a type of cosmetic vigilance system in place. And you need to report any adverse events and reactions to the NMPA. Ingredient and formula management. So the responsible person will submit safety information for the new cosmetic ingredients, because you also have to submit the code, the raw material code for each ingredient. And they will have to update the filings of the formula or the packaging changes. And of course, you will need to update them accordingly. And then they need to cooperate with the authorities, and they will be the main contact in China for any inspections, audits, and regulatory inquiries. Quality and safety. Key responsibility of a quality and safety manager. So clearly, the quality and safety manager needs to oversee this area. And they need to ensure that all the products meet the safety requirements outlined in the Cosmetic Product Safety Assessment Report, otherwise known as CPSAR. They will also need to supervise the manufacturing and testing and monitor compliance with GMP. And of course, you can get a third-party accreditation for GMP. But as I mentioned before, you will need to get a government attestation to be able to be exempt from animal testing. So my recommendation would be to get a third-party assessment to ISO, and then after that, present that to the government of the country that you're in. And the other thing is the quality and safety manager will ensure that the testing, all the different types of testing, is conducted by local China accredited laboratories. Equally, they will need to manage the adverse event reporting, and they will need to ensure the regulatory documentation is complete, accurate, and up to date, usual. And they will also liaise with authorities actually as well as the responsible person. Okay, so I've made excellent time because Jonathan needs to present as well, but just to briefly mention that I started this company just over a year ago. We were actually awarded a little certificate, which was lovely, which certifies that we're an Italian excellence business. So it's for small companies like myself. And I offer training, and as I'm doing now, also consulting services. And also I've been building up quite a lot of digital products.